Join me in welcoming Libby Adler.
Thank you. Whoop. Thank you so much for having me. I have been hearing wonderful things, particularly about the law faculty here for years. And so I'm just delighted to get the chance to come here and meet a bunch of folks, and I've already met a few, and it's been terrific. I just want to get a little sense of who's in the room. It looks like mostly students, is that right? And are you guys undergrads or are you law students? Raise your hand if you're a law student. Okay, no law students. So everybody's in college? And are you guys studying gender and sexuality related stuff mostly? Okay, cool. All right, so administrative law, first of all, is the law of all the government agencies. Everything from HHS to the FDA to the EPA to the SEC. It's the law of all those agencies. It runs the world, in truth. And it'll come up a little bit further along here in the talk. So the title of the discussion is Tracing the Progress of Gay Rights in Political Economy. And that's basically what I've been doing for the last few years. It's the book, Gay Priori, but it's also some related work and a new project that's in the pipeline, which if I don't drone on for too long, maybe I'll talk about a little bit at the end. And altogether, my hope is for these projects is to open an avenue for understanding gay rights in political economic terms and pushing the LGBT movement leftward. So the book provides a critical account of what LGBT legal advocates have been doing for the last 30 or so years and how they've been doing it. And so to state the thesis succinctly, it's that the priorities of the movement have been heavily oriented toward legal forms of equality that provide a lot more advantages to the most privileged members of the LGBT community than to those most in need. And that an important reason for this is something that I've called LGBT equal rights discourse, which I'll explain in a moment, and that there are other ways we could be thinking about law that could help us imagine our priorities differently and benefit more marginalized subsets of the LGBTQ community. So let me start with in what sense LGBTQ equal rights is a discourse. This is something I imagine those of you particularly who are in humanities fields may understand a lot better than I do. But in truth, queer theory has just barely penetrated the legal academy. So when I speak to a law crowd that just doesn't ever use that word, here's what I say. By discourse, I mean a collection of narrative practices evident in LGBT equal rights advocacy. That includes legal advocacy, lay advocacy and grassroots activism, public relations, that together represent, depict, characterize LGBT people and relationships, and that there are recognizable tropes about our virtues and vulnerabilities, and that those tropes have productive power, meaning they produce archetypes of LGBTQ people and then influence the kind of law reform agenda that we can imagine on their behalf. Different strands of the discourse do different things. Some appease the requirements of American constitutional law or the American civil rights progress narrative, and the neoliberal emphasis on personal responsibility. And the book kind of takes up each of these strands, identifies and discusses them. So the strand I thought I'd focus on today emphasizes the love, commitment, and mutual responsibility that same-sex partners provide to one another. Now, I want to be clear that I'm not here to doubt the truth of anyone's love. It's not about truth. It's about the collateral effects of a discourse of love and commitment and mutual responsibility. And that these features of gay and lesbian coupling have been romanticized, contrasted with dependency and criminality, and used as indicators of responsible citizenship. And you can see this in the stories that were used both for PR purposes and in the legal briefs in the same-sex marriage cases that discuss the way that same-sex partners care for one another through illness and care for one another's aging parents and so on. And it comes not just from the advocacy organizations. In the major same-sex marriage cases that happened at the federal level, so that's Perry, the one that started in California, Windsor, the one involving Edith Windsor's estate tax bill that wound up striking down the Defense of Marriage Act, and Obergefell, the big showdown. In all of those big federal cases, high-ranking Republicans, hundreds of them, members of Congress, aides to Republican presidents, RNC officials, former governors, signed on to amicus briefs in the same-sex marriage litigations on the pro-gay side. And what those briefs did was link gay marriage to anti-welfarism. That is, to the idea that if same-sex couples are permitted to marry, they'll be less likely to become dependent on public support. That, in my view, is why so many conservatives came around on same-sex marriage. It was about the privatization of financial responsibility, about containing that responsibility within the marital dyad. Or as Kathy Cohen and Lisa Dugan, two queer theorists on whom I've relied, argue, neoliberal economics has a family values platform, and it's that marriage reduces costs to the public sector. And as it turns out, that platform is entirely amenable to gay and lesbian coupling. That means that the discourse of LGBT equal rights has collaborated in justifying the erosion of the social safety net. Because love means we're responsible for our partners and we won't therefore need to become dependent on public benefits. And if you think back to the pre-Obamacare discussions of health insurance, you'll remember this, right? Gay advocacy groups argued we should be able to marry in order to be able to share our health insurance with our partners. Instead of arguing for universal coverage, right, mainstream gay advocacy groups argued for inclusion in the employer-based system where you could add your spouse to your insurance plan. Moreover, as we tout these mutually responsible partnerships, we've simultaneously been seeking out the protection of the criminal law, especially in the context of hate crimes and bullying. We're saying we're to be protected now, rather than viewed as threats. For those of us who've been around for a while, that's a nice change from LGBT people as child molesters and traitors. But it doesn't serve all LGBT people equally well. And this is evident in intra-LGBT gentrification conflicts that have occurred in big cities around the country, most notably in New York, San Francisco, and Chicago. It is well documented that gay people, gay men especially, have led gentrification in a number of U.S. cities. Gary Gates, who is, I think, without rival, the leading demographer of LGBT people in the U.S., has attested to this and demonstrated it empirically. Gay people, not surprisingly, are seeking out relatively tolerant enclaves that can sustain vibrant arts and food and retail scenes. In bankruptcy, Detroit tuned into this phenomenon enough to meet with banks to try to create a gayborhood, like the San Francisco, like the Castro in San Francisco, or in Boston we have the South End, as part of its revitalization effort. Meanwhile, the proportion of homeless youth who identify as LGBTQ usually come in at around 40%. That's the estimate that you usually see. And so these coexisting facts, gays as gentrifiers, gays as homeless, right, have resulted in conflicts between gay property owners or high-income tenants on the one hand and LGBTQ people who live more of their lives in public spaces on the other. Affluent condo dwellers, for example, in the area near the Christopher Street Pier in New York City's West Village, fought to improve their so-called quality of life by supporting a crackdown on the youth who hang out on the pier. So the kids who hang out on the pier in the West Village in New York, they're mostly LGBTQ, they're mostly of color. Many are homeless or unstably housed. And the most acute period of conflict took place during the mayoral administration of Rudy Giuliani. Policing of the area intensified as part of a kind of cleanup campaign, and youth started getting arrested for all sorts of petty crimes: blocking the sidewalk, loitering, lewdness. And two groups evolved. A vocal group of property owners organized into a group called, I kid you not, RID, for Residents in Distress, which welcomed attention to their security and their property values, and they wanted to see an increased police presence. The youth formed their own grassroots organization called FIERCE, much cooler acronym here. It's for Fabulous Independent Educated Radicals for Community Empowerment. And to protest their treatment by the police and the residents. And these two groups, RID and FIERCE, went at it in community meetings, in neighborhood meetings, about policing, about curfews, about whether the public restrooms on the pier would be locked at night, about whether there would be exorbitant fees imposed on the medical service vans that were serving the kids' health needs. And so you can see how there's this discursive fragment of seeking protection against criminality, right, that's used by the more well-to-do gays, and how it advances their interests, the interests of the gays who are already most advantaged, many of whom they're already benefiting from police protection now that they and their constitutionally protected sodomy takes place in the privacy of their equal and sanctified marital homes. But that not only excludes a broad swath of LGBTQ people, but in some respects actually treats them as threats to their to private property and secure domesticity. Same-sex marriage is the law of the land now, but the fight is still on, as you know, over things like religious exemptions for homophobic cake bakers. And that probably means we haven't heard the end of LGBT equal rights discourse. It may very well be an important part of this next phase. And part of my argument here is that the discourse that this fight elicits impedes a more redistributive agenda that would benefit more economically marginalized sectors of the community. The understanding that I came to reading empirical studies on gay demographics is that our incomes are slightly higher on average. It's not just a stereotype. Our incomes are slightly higher on average, and our rates of poverty, hunger, and homelessness are also slightly higher, right? In other words, the wealth gap between the have and the have-nots in the LGBT community is more pronounced than the wealth gap in the United States generally. And this becomes much less mysterious once you break it down by race, by region of the country, by having children or not, right? All of which are factors that are quite legible in political economic terms. But sexuality has not been adequately conceptualized along those same lines. There's a debate between two feminist social theorists, which if you're taking gender studies classes, you may be coming across, Nancy Fraser and Judith Butler. And a debate between those two helped me sort through the problem of how to understand LGBT people in political economic terms and what legal theoretic tools can do to contribute. So Nancy Fraser wrote this series of essays that some of you are probably familiar with on recognition and redistribution. And in it, she set forth this typology according to which some groups suffer injuries that are principally distributive, defined by the group's position in the political economy, while other groups suffer injuries that are principally recognition-oriented. That is, they're really problems about devaluing representations, negative stereotypes. So the working class would be the quintessential example of the former, right? That group is defined entirely by its subordinate position in the political economy. Gay people, Fraser thought, occupy the position at the opposite pole. That is, while gay people might suffer an economic injury, let's say in the form of job discrimination, the core injury, she thought, was one of non-recognition. And then Fraser said, well, race and sex, those are what she called bivalent, right? So, for example, domestic labor is subordinated in the political economy, but it's also coded in racist and sexist ways. So it has elements of both. But she thought working class goes at this pole, gay people belong at this other pole. She did not see the gay position as bivalent the way she saw race and sex. She used gays as her exemplar of a group that's subordinated by non-recognition, cultural devaluation, stereotyping. So Judith Butler responds and says, you've got it all wrong. Butler's view is that Fraser failed to take on board the lessons of the socialist feminists, right? That specifically, that capitalism depends on compulsory heterosexuality. The heterosexual nuclear family structure supports the structure of production, including by its reproductive function. So any disruption of heterosexual norms or gender expectations, Butler argued, that should be understood as having political economic significance and that is undermining of capitalism. So after reading through this, I came to agree with Butler that Fraser had it wrong, but not for the reasons that Butler provides. And in fact, Butler's analysis seems kind of antiquated to me now, if not just wrong, right? Large corporations love gays now. They advertise to us. They sponsor our parades, right? I have all kinds of things with rainbows and then like a bank's name on it or a big law firm. Hundreds of giant corporations from Goldman Sachs to Starbucks signed on to an amicus brief on the side of the same-sex couples in Obergefell, the big gay marriage case. Capitalism has proven itself entirely amenable to gay rights. And so the key to understanding gay people in political economic terms, I think, doesn't lie in this sort of static understanding of capitalism, according to which capitalism is in some essential way inconsistent with sexuality or gender deviance. It lies instead in a dynamic understanding of law and in the constantly shifting field of bargaining relations among differently situated constituencies. And you have to know a lot about the cross-cutting conditions, right? Not just the sexual orientation and gender, but also the race, the region, the age, and other relevant conditions in order to assess legal needs and identify opportunities for legal intervention that could actually effectuate a redistribution for a particular LGBT subpopulation. So what I've proposed is a way of thinking about law, one that actually has a quite long tradition in legal theory. I didn't invent it, but it just hasn't really been picked up by the gay advocacy community. And what it would do is kind of tear our gaze away from constitutional equality, away from anti-discrimination, away from hate crimes, and redirect attention to what legal thinkers call background rules. So the idea of a background rule is that it establishes the alternatives you have when you make a choice or bargain with someone else. So for example, part of why most of us here who are not students are working for a wage, and most of you who are students will eventually be working for a wage if you're not now, right? Part of why we do that is that the law operating in the background eliminates other alternatives. You can't just pick one of these beautiful houses that I passed on my way from the airport and move in and just squat there. You can't just go down to the cafe and take whatever food you see, right? That's property law. And there's a lot of it operating, kind of conditioning our choices every day. We're just not really noticing it. It's in the background. Law faculty will recognize that I'm leaning here on Robert Hale. So what I've chosen to do here is just I've just picked a vulnerable group, in this case, homeless adolescents. It's a group within the LGBT community. There are a number of very vulnerable groups. I picked homeless adolescents who tend to congregate in urban areas and tried to foreground some of the background conditions that condition their choices every day. Rules about parental authority, foster care, shelter rules, access to credit, child labor, right? Stuff we don't typically think about as LGBT issues. But if we take a really close look at what these kids are contending with, why they end up on the street, what they have to do to survive once they get there, those legal conditions have a lot more to do with their lives than marriage or anti-discrimination law. So just to give one example, and here's where we get to administrative law. HHS, the Department of Health and Human Services, has a regulation that sets forth who is eligible to serve as a payee for child support. That is, who can receive child support money on behalf of a minor child. And basically the answer, according to the regulation, is a resident parent, right? If one parent's in another home and one parent's with the kid, the resident parent can receive the child support, or guardian, or if the family's on welfare or the kid's in the foster care system, the state. That's who can receive child support. Guess who isn't eligible to receive child support? The child is not eligible to receive child support on their own behalf. A youth shelter that the kid might resort to. And if you take that, the inability to receive child support for your own support, along with rules limiting youth access to labor, rules limiting youth access to credit. If you were even able to get an apartment, how are you going to get a refrigerator? You're not going to have the cash, and no credit card company in its right mind is going to give you a credit card without your parent co-signing, right? Those things make it next to impossible for a kid to obtain a legal stream of income. But as Robert Hale said, they still got to eat. He didn't say gotta. They still have to eat. So they work in the underground economy, where anti-discrimination rules are of no use. Instead of thinking about these kids as discriminated against, needing an equality solution, I'm urging that we should bring to the foreground the legal rules with which they are actually contending. It might not have sexual orientation or gender identity written all over it, but they have actually a much more immediate impact on their lives and on their struggle to survive. And we should rethink our law reform agenda with those conditions in mind. So since the book came out, I've tried to take this method to a few other corners of LGBT advancement. I have a forthcoming piece on how little the right to privacy is done for homeless LGBTQ youth, for the obvious reason that if you have no private place to be, the right to privacy doesn't do anything for you. And as a result, we see extremely high rates of arrest for acts that done in public, that if they were done in private would be perfectly legal. Things like sleeping, urinating, changing clothes. So drawn together, the idea is that gay progress in the U.S. has relied principally on these higher order rights claims, equality and privacy, and to state protection against discrimination. And those rights claims have been advanced by a collection of discursive practices, including my love's just as good as your love, And those discursive practices establish contours around our thinking, and particularly around what law reforms we can imagine. And that has largely resulted in neglecting racial, regional, age, and economic and other, I could go a longer list, immigration status, right? It's differences within the LGBT community. I've been teaching law for about 20 years, and just in the last few years, I've joined this amazing interdisciplinary crew of women, gender, and sexuality studies scholars, and what I really, I'm a lawyer, and the people I work with in the law school were all lawyers, and so they're from this new interdisciplinary position. I've had just a fresh, brand new learning opportunity that's just been amazing. And what I've been able to take from queer and critical theory that I actually, I'm interested in for its own sake, but I'm really interested in it for what I can bring back to law, right? And what I've brought back to law, what I've been able to get from it is the importance of discursive forces in producing a limited range of law reform vision. And what I think law has to offer back is a critique of rights, which I didn't talk too much about today, but it's elaborated in the book, and I can talk more about it if people want to, and work in background rules, with an overall purpose of urging the LGBT movement leftward, which to me means having at its core a kind of intersectional cognizance, that is, we are not one monolith, but rather a lot of different subpopulations facing different legal conditions, needing different legal interventions. And the other element of moving leftward to me means having a redistributive purpose. How am I doing on time? Am I okay? Okay, so I'll just say a few words about the project I'm starting, and then I'll welcome your reactions. So, if the flaw that, or at least what I'm saying, I've been calling a flaw in U.S. LGBT law reform has been this over-reliance on identity-based equality claims and privacy, too little attention paid to redistribution. How might LGBT progress differ in a legal environment in which rights claims and particularist identities are disfavored, but downward redistribution is quite ordinary? Cuba used to send gay men to labor camps, quarantine HIV-positive individuals, and now they're paying for sex reassignment surgery as part of the national health care plan. How'd they get there? There's no right to free expression, or assembly, or privacy. Particularist identities can't get any purchase there. Don't complain about racial inequality. They don't want to hear it because it undermines the ideology of the revolution, that the revolution made us all equal. There's barely any commercial sector. NGOs are scarce. There's no impact litigation. But Cuba is quite comfortable with top-down redistribution of resources. So what I'm interested in the project that I've just been working on the last few months, but I imagine will take a few years, is what can be learned by comparing our own U.S. legal culture and the trajectory of LGBTQ progress, the way it's happened here, largely based on mega rights, to one that is so unfriendly to the tools we've relied on, but is actually completely at ease with something that the U.S. is quite resistant to, which is downward redistribution of wealth. So that's where I'm headed next, and thanks for listening. Do
you want to take your own question?
Sure. Please.
So hi.
Hi. Cool.
First of all, I want to thank you for cheering with us today and highlighting the between marginalized identities and marginalized communities and those majority identities within the LGBT community. My question particularly kind of relates to that and the political tools that you referenced, particularly those economic tools and the language kind of centered around that. Who would you say is in charge of those political tools? Where, is it these people in those privileged positions that, is this something that's kind of just been passed down, these tools, something passed down from history, kind of culturally or what have you, or is this something that has kind of has been redistributed to those people
That's interesting.
in those privileged positions? And how do people of those marginalized communities get in a position where they are able to utilize those tools?
Yeah. Yeah, so there's some really good work. Gwendolyn Leachman, who's a law person, and Sandra Levitsky, who I want to say is a sociologist, they've both done some work on the way that the well-funded legal organizations that tend to be pretty elite, it's pretty hard to get those, ACLU, Lambda, right, those kinds of organizations, how the outsized influence that those organizations have on the reform agenda, even when they're sort of at least giving some nods to grassroots groups that are much less well resourced, have much higher rates of turnover, less likely to have lawyers, and less likely to have, super professionalized PR people, right? And so there's no doubt that the legal organizations get more money and attention and more power. And not only that, but I believe it was Leachman's study that found that it actually, the legal organizations, the ACLU type organizations, actually wound up influencing the agendas of the grassroots organizations because they needed to latch on to the attention that the big rich organizations were able to garner from the media and whatever. So, and get their grant money and all that kind of stuff. So there is no doubt that the more elite, much more professionalized, disproportionately white entities are, exercise more power. I guess, and there's a lot to be said about that. I think, and I don't know if you guys, were you guys going to bring Dean Spade? Because that's one of Dean's big things. No. Oh, okay. So there's definitely a lot to be said about that. I mean, I think my own argument has been more that lawyers have more tools than they're using. And on behalf of the LGBT community, as opposed to making the argument that lawyers should take a back seat and let the grassroots rule, which is an interesting and valid argument. It's not the argument I'm making. The argument that I've made is that they ought to listen a lot harder to the people on the ground and to identify their regular encounters with law, right? So, for example, but then they're lawyers, and they should then turn to their toolkit and not only look at the top drawer. There's a whole bunch of other tools down there that are in administrative law, contract law, labor law, a million other areas of law that they're not using. I worked for a while with the guy who runs the poverty clinic at my law school, and we worked with this LGBT youth center that mostly was low-income kids coming from low-income neighborhoods, disproportionately homeless or unstably couch surfing, that kind of thing. And when we first approached them and asked them what their legal issues were, they were entirely in the head of LGBT civil rights. And they said, oh, well, when somebody gets discriminated against, we call GLAAD, which is our regional civil rights organization. But then after we talked with them a little further and kind of pushed them more, it turned out that they had kids who were applying for food stamps under one name, and 6 months ago they had applied for disability under a different name, and because they were trans, they had in between changed their name, and they got a no-match letter. They were rejected for food stamps because the big giant federal computer system, right? I mean, you gotta get close. We didn't know that. You had to get close to see that, right? So taking the cues from the grassroots level but as lawyers, knowing that there are other tools you can use, right, to address the problems as the grassroots helps you identify them is sort of the push. That's my push. Does that answer your question? Okay. Yeah.
I was wondering if you think that this change could come from those kind of larger, more well-known LGBT law organizations like Lambda or ACLU2, or if you think it's going to take a new kind of generation of new LGBT law.
That's a really good question. It's a hard question to ask because I've seen signs that go in both directions, right? That is, I do think that the big funders of the big organizations, their interests tend to be at the high level, at the recognition level, as opposed to at the distributive level, right? And so I think it's very hard to talk to gay Wall Street guys, right, about HHS regulations. I don't think some of them will care because that's their politics, but it's not gonna get them here, right? So I think in that sense, that's a huge obstacle. At the same time, just from some of the individual people that I know who are in some of those organizations pushing for things that are a little bit more oriented toward poverty and violence and some of the things that are happening more at the street level, I know there are people inside who are trying. But I think that it's a struggle. So in the end, I don't know if there's a one winner that kind of takes charge. I think it's going to be an ongoing, dynamic. Yeah.
So I want to piggyback, I guess, on all of that and ask you to just talk more directly about two of the things that, for instance, those homeless adolescents might end up relying on when they're locked out of the official labor market, and that's the struggles right now around sex work and decriminalization of certain kinds of drugs. And what do you see as the kind of like radical LGBT position around, I'm thinking about like Decrim New York and some of those organizations.
Yeah.
But like, how are those struggles?
It's just amazing. So I have less familiarity with the drug side, but on the sex work side, what I would say is that they come really slowly to it, but they do seem to be coming to it, right? So, for example, in New York City, there was this big argument about whether, this is the kind of thing that you have to be on the ground to see it, right? Whether the volume of condoms someone is carrying on their person can be used as evidence that they are engaged in prostitution. If it can be used as evidence, sex workers are not going to carry a huge volume of condoms, which will put them and their customers at greater risk of transmitting diseases, right? If it's not usable as evidence, then the cops are giving up a form of evidence. But at the same time, it would be it's a harm minimization, right? Strategy. So it took a while, but eventually Lambda joined the fight, right? Late, but they joined it. Also, I think, I'm not sure if GLAAD, I'm sure, I would be stunned if HRC had come out in favor of this. It's completely not the politics of that organization. I believe that Amnesty International has issued a pro-sex work. I don't know if they've come out on the condoms issue specifically, but just in general, they're for decriminalization internationally. Not specifically as an LGBT issue, but just generally as a harm mitigation strategy. And so, I think that this is exactly the kind of issue that the LGBT organizations ought to be on the ground floor. The feminist organizations have been fighting about this kind of thing for years. They're not all on the side that I deem right, but they've at least been having this dialogue for, at least since the 1980s and probably a long time before that, right? But certainly during the sex wars. I'd like to see the LGBT organizations recognize that that's our fight. And I'm open to drugs being part of it too. I have thought less about that one. Yeah.
I was wondering if you could explain a little bit further on your argument for why you believe that redistribution would be like the best course of action. So how would that be the best alternative to say like Medicare for all in terms of like just as an example?
I think Medicare for all is redistribution. Absolutely.
Oh, okay.
Absolutely. As opposed to saying, let's keep healthcare structured exactly as it is, but let gay people marry so they can share their employment-based health insurance. Providing universal health care on the public dime is the definition of a redistributive objective. Absolutely.
Kind of on the note of heteronormativity, it seems like you were kind of hitting at that with the way those gay couples are marrying and wanting to get offered into the health insurance structure.
Yeah.
I guess I'm more interested in how that works related to gentrification in those popular cities like San Francisco, New York, Chicago, where we know that there's a huge LGBT population.
Yeah.
And how the economics of that is harming those queer communities in those areas, and how that redistribution
Yeah.
wealth really takes that toll on those marginalized people who can't.
Yeah, so I'll give you a good example of this, and San Francisco is the perfect locale to illustrate this. So San Francisco, according to Gary Gates, if I'm remembering right, there's a correlation between very gay cities and cities with a lot of patents. That is where a lot of innovation is occurring. And you can measure it in registered patents, right? So it's not a coincidence, he doesn't think, that San Francisco has a very high level of registered patents and a really big gay population. Innovative people like to live in open-minded places. That's the working theory. So so there's a neighborhood in San Francisco called the Tenderloin. It's not the same as the Castro, it's lower income, but it's definitely where a lot of marginalized, sexualized populations are living, disproportionately people of color. And it came later than the Castro, got gentrified later than the Castro or Noe Valley, which was where all the lesbians lived. It got gentrified later, but it is gentrifying, and part of the reason it's gentrifying is that people who work in Silicon Valley can buy in the Tenderloin, and then the big companies, the sort of Google-type companies, have commuter buses, their own private, what do you call them? Like campuses have them too. What are they? Shuttles. Like a shuttle that will stop in the Tenderloin, pick up the Google employees, and take them to work with Wi-Fi and whatever. So what they've done is effectively make it more possible to displace the lower income people of the Tenderloin with the higher income people who work in Silicon Valley, right? By allowing these shuttles. And then the question was, here's the legal question, right? You can't stop Google from buying a shuttle. But the legal question is, this is a question of local law. It's not a big constitutional question. It's a little question of local law. Would the shuttles have to pay to use the bus stops? And they were initially letting them use them for free, despite local law that said private users had to pay. And then when there was a protest, they started charging them $1 a day. So the struggle over how much the public sector can charge Google to use the bus stops in the Tenderloin is going to have an effect on who lives in the Tenderloin and who is gentrified out, right? So there's a really direct connection, but again, it's not happening up here. I'm not sure this gets to your question about, you initially said about, heteronormativity or whatever, but it definitely gets to the question of, there's a direct link there to effects on low-income communities. Yeah.
The civil rights wins, like gay marriage, made it harder to achieve the redistributive aims. Like thinking about how
Yeah.
when gay marriage was legalized, then a lot of employers started getting rid of domestic partnerships.
Right.
Or then taxing domestic partnership. Like
Yeah.
a domestic partner like mine could get health insurance through you. If she was going to stay on my insurance, she would be taxed. Like,
Right.
are we worse off?
It's a really good question. And to me, this is like the same question, or a very parallel question to, did Brown versus Board of Education allow us to be more segregated? Do you know what I mean? Right. Once you have a formal rule that says official segregation is unconstitutional, then it allows, so it's been outlawed. We've done that already. You look around, it doesn't look done. But at the constitutional level, it's been done. And so at the same time, do I want to go back to a world without Brown versus Board of Education? No, I do not. But I do want to note that Brown had costs, right? Brown had costs, right? And that you wonder if the people who, if the NAACP had known that, 60, 70 years later, we would be as segregated, almost as segregated now as we were then, despite the legal, formal, constitutional decision. I wonder how their calculus would have gone. And so I think it's, in some ways, it's kind of too soon, right? I definitely think that, there were gay organizations that said as soon as Obergefell, not even when Obergefell was won, but when they knew it was coming, right? When we had Windsor and the boulder was rolling downhill, there was just no stopping it. Already the gay organizations were like, okay, we got a lot left to do, and we got to get anti-discrimination laws all through the South. And they were like, but our donors are going to be done. They got what they want. Right? They can pass their $6 million West Village condo to one another in death without tax consequences. They're done. So that sort of relationship between formal legal change and actual lived change is, it's really, I wish I were the person who had the answer to that problem. You know what I mean? Like, all I can say is, like, I see some benefits, I see some costs. The costs seem to me under-recognized in this particular context. Yeah.
I'd like to follow up.
Okay. That's okay.
First is, if the 70 years is not enough, can you put like a tangible number on what might be enough? Like, I know that might be super difficult to do, but in terms of, how long should we be waiting for that change to come?
Yeah.
And then the second part to that is, given the current presidential leadership, cases like DOMA, some conversations, Roe versus Wade, and some of those other constitutional laws and policies that have kind of paved the way for LGBT rights in certain ways, not in others.
Mm-hmm.
Are any of those at risk? And with the current leadership, what would be the process of
Yeah.
mitigating that if it does come to that?
Yeah, I mean, you're sort of asking me like just a kind of, as a con law teacher, what do you think what's going to happen, right? And I think that, are you guys con law teachers? You guys teach con law? Nobody teaches con law? I don't know. My reading, and this is just me reading the newspaper and being a con law teacher, right? But, my reading on this is that it's all about Justice Roberts modulating the pace of change in a rightward direction. He wants to see it go, but he doesn't want it to go too fast because he's a deep believer in the legitimacy of the system. He takes seriously his job of preserving it. And he knows that the legitimacy of the system takes a huge hit if tomorrow we lose gay marriage, the right to abortion, and anything else that's kind of been in advance in the last century. And I suspect it's going to be a slow eroding, and then it's just a question of who's the next president, which justice retires next. I mean, we all just have to wait this stuff out. Yeah.
Do you think that the legal changes and achievements such as gay marriage have changed the social climate in this country drastically, or do you think it's just
I do.
kind of a guise to ignore progressive
I do think it's changed the climate, but it's had weird and interesting effects. So for example, I read one article that said that, so some people have asked me in talks, do you think that the fact of gay marriage and anti-discrimination laws and all the kind of stuff you're saying didn't help these kids? Is it possible that it did just by making their parents a little bit more tolerant and not kicking them out of the house? So that's possible. But the only real data point I've seen on this suggests that the other effect has been that kids come out earlier, their parents aren't ready for it, and so they're getting kicked out just as much, only younger. So I think there's so many moving pieces, it's hard to figure out in the end whether the advances that I do think, I think there's no doubt that, sometimes I walk around, I just can't even believe all the rainbow flags. I grew up in the 1980s in upstate New York, and there's just no rainbow flags. It's just, just implausible. I just feel like I lived through a century. And so, yes, I've definitely witnessed change. There's no doubt there's change. But also there are these costs of people who are getting left behind because the rainbow flag didn't do anything to change the basic conditions of their life,
Maybe this is kind of leading too far into the critical theory side of this.
Okay.
But when you mentioned that capitalism has no problem with gay people.
Yeah.
However, your comments on gentrification by gay people, do you not think there might be a link between the embracing of the gay market and the enfranchisement of the gay market in economics not have a connection to affluent gay individuals gentrifying?
I absolutely think so. No, I mean, your point is totally well taken. I think that's completely right. The idea that capitalism has absorbed gay equality with such unbelievable ease is frightening and shows that the variations in the community along lines of race and class and region and so on, things that are more legible in political economic terms, that is hugely problematic, and I think that's why we have these gentrification debates. Did you have a question or something to say?
You talk about the fact that homophobic and transphobic parenting styles are not considered neglect or abuse of children, but you don't really say a whole lot about how it might become some sort of reform campaign to do that. Could you say a little bit more about that?
Oh yeah, and this is another administrative law question, right? To get at that, you would need to do advocacy with the foster care agency, with the agencies, and with the juvenile courts, or whatever courts run that system in your jurisdiction. In Massachusetts, the juvenile courts. So for example, if you are going to be a foster parent with the intention of fostering or adopting or both, there are regulatory criteria that you need to meet. Among them, in most jurisdictions, maybe it's all, is that you have to be willing to affirm the kid's racial and cultural heritage, right? So if you're transracially fostering or adopting, you have to be prepared to do that. But there's only a handful of states that say you have to be affirming to the kid's gender or sexual identity, right? So that the transracial thing didn't just come out of nowhere. Somewhere along the line, somebody had to advocate for that. Right, and I would imagine that happened around the same time as we got, the Indian Child Welfare Act and the Adoption Assistance Child Welfare Act, the big laws that sort of were responding to the fact that lots of white people adopt lots of kids of color, and so somewhere in that moment where we were wrangling over that issue. I would imagine that's when it happened, that the regs started to require, okay, if we're going to have white parents adopting kids of color or fostering kids of color, they had to be prepared in some way, right? And but we have in Massachusetts we now have a rule that says you have to be willing to affirm the kid's sexual identity or gender identity. But most jurisdictions don't have that. So I think, advocating before those agencies, and it could at some point, depending on how big an issue it became, it could ultimately become, a big federal case, because the parent who doesn't want to do that is going to make a free expression and religion claim the same as the religious baker, right? I get to raise kids in the manner of my faith and I express myself freely. Those are my First Amendment guarantees. So we could wind up with a big litigation over it if that effort got made.
So I take all of your points about constitutional discourse being overrated, highly overrated. Civil rights discourse being not as successful as we would like it to be. Isn't it also possible that the problem here is not just using constitutional discourse, but also like going after and coveting and seeking to enter the institution of marriage itself? And it's like going after the most retrograde institution possible.
Yeah.
Saying we want to be a part of it, and going after the institution that has basically allowed like governments to privatize dependency.
Exactly.
And so it's not just the constitutional part.
Yeah.
You could have gone after something.
Totally right.
Employment law, right?
And in that sense, it's fundamentally conservative, one could say. That's another reason why the conservatives, not all of them, there are certainly some set of conservatives who still heterosexual only, but yeah, I mean, there's no doubt that I think one of the reasons that conservatives came around was because they like marriage. They think it's a really good institution. As I begin this Cuba project, Cuba has a really low marriage rate and a really high divorce rate. And, marriage is one of the things that there's a struggle over there. And they just had a constitutional convention and a revised constitution in 2018. There was an effort to get gay marriage into their new constitution. The Catholic Church rose up and defeated it. But one of the questions I kind of have is like, why do they want it? In Cuba, what do they need it for? They already don't marry. The ones who marry divorce. And right, they don't need it for things like health insurance because they already have that. What do they want it for? It's really hard to understand, right? So I haven't figured it out yet, but
So maybe you could go after other things that took on like super status.
Right.
Thinking of like Title VII things and like upcoming cases. I think maybe those would be things that you would prefer to take on as opposed to like going after marriage.
Yeah, I mean, I think the Title VII cases that are before the Supreme Court right now, I think those are actually pretty important. Despite the fact that they won't do much for the population I'm talking about, I actually do think for your regular workaday person who's gay or trans, it's going to matter. Yeah. Any thoughts? Yeah.
The United States, as the big brother country, so one might say, are we influencing policy anywhere else kind of along the same guidelines as presidential leadership?
Yeah.
I guess, are we setting a precedent for how other countries are handling these specific issues when it comes to?
Yeah, and not always well. Yeah, it's a good question. And we don't always do it quite right. I mean, so there are a couple of big funds, one through USAID, one through, forget what the other one's from, but these giant funds that tend to be kind of public-private partnership funds where, big companies and firms join with public funding to try to, help out grassroots organizations like in Nigeria, right? And then, it turns out the Nigerians are like, well, thanks for the money, but actually the way you want it to do this is not going to work in our setting. We don't use the same categories you do. You're not helping us. And so you do get these sort of, you do hear these stories about this misattunement, this cultural misattunement. The person who's written most about this is Joseph Mossad. He's a sociologist, political scientist, whatever. He at Columbia. He's written, and in the context of Egypt, he has a seething seething, was that the word I wanted? A really angry and searing, that was what I wanted, searing critique of the way that the U.S. kind of went in guns a-blazing after a raid on a gay men's party, a disco party on a boat on the Nile. And there was basically what Mossad's argument is that what the U.S. didn't realize when they kind of came in and demanded gay rights and equality for these guys was that gay wasn't really a thing in Egypt. It was there were people who engaged in same-sex sodomy without the identity all over the country, right? But they weren't calling themselves gay. It was just some part of their sexual practice. And but then this disco boat was a particularly select group of wealthy Egyptian men who had internet access, spoke English, were kind of hobnobbing with the rich and famous, and there was a big party that they went to, and that's what got raided. And what Mossad's argument is that what the Egyptians were really after was that kind of Western kind of imperialistic imposition, that sort of cultural imposition, but that they'd been ignoring same-sex sodomy forever, and then suddenly when the U.S. started demanding gay rights, they started policing the countryside. And all the guys who weren't calling themselves gay were like, what, I'm gay? And now I'm in trouble? What happened? Yeah.
That reminds me, there was something I think you could explain so much more eloquently than I am, so I keep talking about your book in classes. But the kind of contradiction even within the U.S. between the arguments that like gay people are exactly the same as everyone else, or gay people are a very specific minority, and how you go about policing that.
Yeah.
And so could you just talk a little bit about that contradiction as it plays out here? Because it seems like that's a version of what you were just getting at.
Is it?
Well, in the sense that one could make an argument that in some sense, I'm just thinking Kinsey, right? So the Kinsey spectrum would make queerness sort of like omnipresent in a way that couldn't be reduced to a minority identity and therefore protectable.
Right.
But legally speaking, that's not a direction a whole bunch of people want to go.
Right.
So how do you kind of play with, I think you hang it on Sedgwick's.
Yeah, on Sedgwick, exactly. Minoritizing, universalizing. Yeah, exactly. That there are, that just kind of pointing out there, I don't have a solution to this, but it's just an observation really that that the gay rights advocates have used both minoritizing and universalizing tropes, and without necessarily anticipating that those same tropes can get, both sides of that can get used for good or for ill, right? So if we're a minority on the gay side, we are therefore entitled to this certain kind of protection from the law and anti-discrimination, whatever. On the anti-gay side, you're just a minority. Other people don't really have to worry about you. On the universalizing side, we all have a stake in this. We're all at least a little gay, right? So everybody's got a stake in this. And then, on the anti-gay side, well, if that's true, then we also all can kind of control who we are, make a heterosexual choice, and, you don't deserve any particular kind of protection. We all slightly want to steal stuff, too, but we don't. Right? Do you know what I mean? So, that's the kind of universalizing, minoritizing trap, and in the same dynamic goes for we're injured, we're healthy, right? That we're injured, we're all because of homophobia and bullying and all kinds of other things. We're all suffering minority stress. We're depressed. We abuse substances. We're suicidal. On the other hand. But as soon as we grow up, we're capable of really healthy, loving relationships and being great parents. Really? 6 years ago, you were depressed, suicidal, and abusing substances, right? And then, so both of those can get turned for good or for ill, right? When it comes to legal purposes, there's always a demand, it seems like, when you're doing anti-discrimination law. I'm like, I'm unlike, I'm like, I'm unlike. That, it's just one of the dynamics of that area of law. Thanks a lot. Those are great questions.